The Nazi regime in Germany, from 1933 to 1945, represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. Under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, Germany transformed into a totalitarian state that wielded extraordinary power over its citizens. In this video, we'll explore how life was in Nazi Germany, not just from a political perspective, but also how it affected the everyday lives of ordinary Germans, the dynamics of Nazi society, and how the war turned a nation into a war machine. From the rise of the Nazi Party to the horrors of the Holocaust and the impact of World War II on civilian life, we will break down key moments that shaped German society during these years. We'll look at the government's control mechanisms, the role of propaganda, the persecution of minorities, the economic and social policies, and the harsh realities for those caught in the gears of war. By the end of this video, you will have a much clearer understanding of how deeply Nazi ideology penetrated German society and how people lived, resisted, and survived during the Third Reich. To understand the rise of the Nazis, we must first look at the Weimar Republic, the democratic government that ruled Germany from 1919 to 1933. The Weimar Republic was born out of defeat in World War I, and it was plagued by economic instability, hyperinflation, and political fragmentation. The Treaty of Versailles, which held Germany responsible for the war, led to widespread resentment. The 1920s saw the rise of extremist political groups, including the Nazis, who promised to restore Germany's former glory. The Great Depression of 1929 hit Germany especially hard, pushing millions into unemployment and poverty. This created fertile ground for extremist movements, with the Nazis offering simple, populist solutions: a return to national pride, the destruction of communism, and the scapegoating of Jews, who were blamed for the country's economic woes. Adolf Hitler's rise was both a product of his unique personality and the broader economic and political crises. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, which would later become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the NSDAP, in 1919. His charisma and ability to channel the frustrations of the German people made him a compelling figure. Hitler's vision of Germany was one based on Aryan racial purity, aggressive expansionism, and antisemitism. The Nazis promised to undo the perceived injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, rearm Germany, and reclaim territories lost after World War I. Their radical nationalism was paired with a desire to establish a racial hierarchy, placing Germans at the top and Jews, Romani people, and Slavs at the bottom. Antisemitism was at the core of Nazi ideology, with Hitler's vision of a world free of Jews being integral to the regime's goals. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933 was the beginning of the end for the Weimar Republic. Within months, Hitler used the Reichstag fire as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and gave him sweeping powers. Soon after, the Enabling Act was passed, which allowed Hitler to rule by decree, effectively making him a dictator. This period saw the Nazi regime dismantling democratic institutions and silencing political opposition. Political parties were banned, the press was censored, and enemies of the regime, whether communists, socialists, or Jews, were persecuted. The SS, Schutzstaffel, and the Gestapo, secret police, were established to enforce Nazi policies and eliminate any threat to Hitler's rule. Joseph Goebbels, appointed Minister of Propaganda, understood the power of media in shaping public opinion. Under his direction, the Nazis controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and even the arts. The Nuremberg rallies, for example, were grand spectacles designed to inspire national unity and glorify Hitler. The regime's propaganda focused on creating a singular, unified vision of German identity, one rooted in nationalism, militarism, and racial purity. This propaganda was effective in aligning many Germans with Nazi ideals, especially in the early years of the regime. The Nazi regime was a totalitarian state, meaning that it sought total control over every aspect of life. At its core was the Führer principle, which emphasized that Hitler was the ultimate authority in all matters, political and social. This cult of personality elevated Hitler to near-godlike status, and he was portrayed as the savior of Germany, capable of restoring national pride and defeating Germany's enemies. Hitler's authority was absolute, and he ruled through a combination of charisma, coercion, and fear. The Nazi regime was built on hierarchical structures that demanded complete obedience to Hitler's will, and dissent was not tolerated. The SS, initially a small group of Hitler's bodyguards, grew into one of the most powerful and feared organizations in Nazi Germany. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS became responsible for many of the regime's most brutal policies, including the operation of concentration camps and the implementation of the final solution. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, was responsible for spying on and arresting those who opposed the regime. They used intimidation, surveillance, and torture to enforce loyalty and suppress resistance. The SS and Gestapo also played pivotal roles in rounding up Jews and other minorities for deportation to death camps. The Nazis placed great importance on indoctrinating young Germans into their ideology. The Hitler Youth was a youth organization designed to teach children Nazi ideals, including loyalty to the Führer, physical fitness, and hatred of Jews. Children were also taught to aspire to militaristic careers, with boys being groomed for the army and girls being prepared for roles as wives and mothers. The education system was restructured to emphasize racial science and anti-Semitic beliefs. Textbooks were rewritten to reflect Nazi ideology, and teachers who refused to conform were removed from their positions. The Nazis aimed to create a generation that would be loyal to the state and prepared to fight for the ideals of the Third Reich. The Nazis sought to control all aspects of public life, including religion. While the Nazis made some attempts to ally with Protestant churches through the German Christians movement, they quickly moved to control or suppress religious institutions that might oppose the regime. The Catholic Church, in particular, faced repression, as the Nazis saw its allegiance to the Pope as a potential rival to Hitler's authority. Censorship was widespread, and art, literature, and even music were tightly regulated to align with Nazi values. Degenerate art, which included works by Jewish and communist artists, was banned, while the regime promoted a vision of German culture that was closely tied to Nazi ideals. When Hitler took power, the German economy was in shambles. The Nazis implemented a series of economic policies aimed at reducing unemployment, boosting industrial production, and making Germany self-sufficient, autarky. This included large infrastructure projects like the construction of the Autobahn highway system to create jobs, as well as military rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The German economy shifted to prioritize military production, and private industries were integrated into the state-controlled economy. The war economy created massive demand for goods, and millions of workers, including forced laborers, were employed in factories producing arms and supplies for the German war effort. Under Nazi rule, women were expected to focus on motherhood and homemaking. The Nazis promoted the ideal of the Aryan mother, who would give birth to many children to contribute to the future of the German Reich. Women were encouraged to stay out of the workforce and focus on raising children and supporting their husbands. However, as World War II escalated, women were gradually brought into the workforce. Many worked in factories or served in auxiliary military roles, such as in the German Red Cross or the Voluntary Labor Service. Despite the regime's ideal of domesticity, the war effort required the mobilization of women on a large scale. The middle class was one of the primary beneficiaries of Nazi economic policies. After years of instability, many middle-class Germans saw the rise of the Nazis as a return to order and prosperity. Nazi policies encouraged private property ownership and a return to traditional values, appealing to small business owners and skilled workers. For the working class, conditions improved somewhat, as the Nazis abolished unemployment and provided social welfare programs like the Strength Through Joy, Kraft durch Freude initiative, which offered affordable leisure activities, vacations, and entertainment. Anti-Semitism was at the core of Nazi ideology. The Nazis did not merely seek to discriminate against Jews, they wanted to eliminate them entirely. The regime's anti-Semitic policies began shortly after Hitler came to power. In 1933, the Nazis launched a boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, and soon after, Laws were passed to exclude Jews from professional positions in government, education, and the arts. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 were a major step in institutionalizing antisemitism, stripping Jews of their German citizenship, and segregating them from the rest of society. Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938 marked a violent escalation in anti-Semitic policy. On that night, Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses were destroyed, and thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The event served as a precursor to the systematic extermination of Jews. By 1941, the Nazis had begun the implementation of the final solution, a euphemism for the mass extermination of Jews. Jews were rendered up in ghettos, and eventually, they were transported to extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile death squads, were responsible for mass shootings of Jews and other targeted groups, while Industrieligist killing through gas chambers marked the horrors of the Holocaust. It is estimated that 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. While Jews were the primary target of Nazi persecution, many other groups were also targeted by the regime. Romani people, often referred to as gypsies, were considered racially inferior and were subject to persecution and extermination alongside Jews. Thousands of Romani people were sent to concentration camps and killed. The Nazis also targeted people with disabilities. Under the T4 program, thousands of disabled individuals were murdered through euthanasia, which was presented as mercy killings to rid Germany of those deemed unfit or inferior. Children, the elderly, and adults with physical and mental disabilities were systematically murdered, often in gas chambers. The regime also oppressed LGBTQ individuals, particularly gay men. Homosexuality was criminalized, and gay men were sent to concentration camps, where they faced torture and execution. Other groups, such as communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political dissidents, were persecuted by the regime as well, as the Nazis sought to eliminate any form of opposition. Despite the Nazi regime's ruthless control, there was some resistance from individuals and groups who opposed its policies. Resistance movements ranged from small acts of defiance to more organized efforts to overthrow the regime. One of the most notable examples of resistance was the White Rose movement, a group of students and professors from the University of Munich who distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets urging Germans to resist Hitler. The group was eventually caught, and its members were executed. In addition, there were several attempts on Hitler's life, the most famous being the 1944 assassination plot known as the July 20th plot, led by a group of military officers within the German army. Although the plot failed, it demonstrated that some in the German military and political elite were beginning to recognize the dangers of Hitler's policies. The Nazi regime used propaganda as a tool to maintain control over the population and to mold public perception. From the moment Hitler came to power, the Nazis began to saturate every part of German society with their ideology. One of the most powerful ways they achieved this was through the use of mass rallies and spectacles. The Nuremberg rallies, for instance, were grand, orchestrated events designed to showcase Nazi power and unity. These rallies were massive displays of loyalty to Hitler and the party, and they became iconic representations of the regime's control. Through these rallies, the Nazis aimed to create a sense of unity and shared purpose among the German people. Propaganda also permeated everyday life. The use of radio broadcasts, films, posters, and newspapers helped spread Nazi ideology. Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will, 1935, is one of the most famous examples of Nazi propaganda, capturing the grandeur of the Nuremberg rallies and the power of Hitler. The regime also promoted the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, an idealized vision of a racially pure and united Germany. In this vision, Germans were all supposed to work together for the benefit of the nation, and individual desires were to be subordinated to the needs of the state. As World War II escalated, life in Germany became increasingly difficult. Air raids, bombings, and the overall destruction of German cities became part of daily life. Major cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were targeted by Allied bombers, and the German civilian population suffered the consequences. The bombings killed tens of thousands of civilians and displaced millions more. In addition to the physical destruction caused by the war, German civilians had to contend with rationing, food shortages, and the scarcity of basic goods. The government instituted strict controls on food, fuel, and clothing, with citizens given ration cards to purchase what was available. As the war dragged on, it became clear that the Nazis were losing, and the German population began to feel the full brunt of the Allied advance. The morale of the German people began to falter as they faced the prospect of total defeat, and the Nazi regime's promises of victory and national greatness began to ring hollow. Despite the hardships of war, the Nazi regime worked hard to provide entertainment for the population, especially to maintain morale. Their Strength Through Joy program, Kraft durch Freude, KDF, was designed to offer affordable leisure activities to working-class Germans. This included cheap vacations, concerts, and cultural events. The KDF also organized mass recreational activities, such as boating and hiking, to promote physical fitness and the ideals of the regime. Film and music were other key areas of Nazi cultural control. The regime heavily censored and manipulated the arts to reflect its ideology. Music that was deemed degenerate or UN German was banned, and composers like Richard Wagner, whose works were associated with German nationalism, were promoted. Similarly, films like The Eternal Jew, 1940, served as propaganda pieces to demonize Jews and reinforce Nazi racial ideology. However, the Nazis also used cinema to entertain the public. While propaganda films like Triumph of the Will were celebrated, there were also popular films that focused on escapism or adventure, often depicting German heroism and the superiority of the Aryan race. As the war progressed, the quality of life for many Germans significantly deteriorated. Food became scarce, and rationing meant that most Germans could only get limited amounts of essentials. Meals consisted mainly of bread, potatoes, and soup, and meat was a luxury that many could rarely afford. The clothing situation was similarly bleak, with textile factories focused on producing uniforms and military supplies. Civilian clothing became more basic and difficult to obtain. Many people had to rely on donations from charity organizations or repurpose old clothes to make do. Housing conditions also worsened. Many Germans lived in overcrowded and poorly maintained apartments, especially in urban areas. As the war intensified, millions of civilians were forced to flee their homes due to bombings. In some areas, particularly in cities like Berlin and Hamburg, the destruction was so severe that entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, marked the beginning of World War II. The swift and brutal attack on Poland, known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, was a new form of warfare that relied on rapid, overwhelming attacks by air and ground forces. The success of this strategy led to the fall of Poland in just weeks, and by 1940, the Nazis had taken control of much of Western Europe. In the early years of the war, many Germans supported the regime's military successes, believing that Hitler was fulfilling his promise of restoring Germany to greatness. The economy boomed as the war effort provided jobs, and Nazi propaganda painted the victories as signs of Germany's inevitable triumph. As the war dragged on and the Allies gained ground, Germany faced increasing air raids. Major cities, such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, were heavily bombed. The bombings led to massive civilian casualties and left millions of Germans homeless. The destruction of German infrastructure and factories disrupted the war effort and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Nazi state. While the air raids took a heavy toll on civilian life, the German population continued to endure, with many finding ways to survive under the harsh conditions. Bomb shelters became a common part of daily life, and many civilians participated in fire brigades or other volunteer efforts to protect their homes and communities from the bombings. By 1944, the war was turning in favor of the Allies. The D-Day invasion, the Soviet advances on the Eastern Front, and the loss of key battles such as Stalingrad meant that the Nazi war machine was no longer invincible. In the final months of the war, German civilians faced constant bombings, food shortages, and a collapsing infrastructure. As the Allies closed in on Germany from all sides, the civilian population suffered tremendously. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered, marking the end of the war in Europe. The fall of Nazi Germany left a nation in ruins, both physically and morally. Many Germans had to confront the horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation wrought by the war. The post-war period brought widespread disillusionment, but also a long process of rebuilding and reckoning with the past. Life in Nazi Germany was shaped by a mixture of fear, propaganda, and extreme ideological control. From the economic struggles and social changes that allowed Hitler to rise to power, to the eventual collapse of the regime under the weight of war and its own brutal policies, Nazi Germany left a dark and indelible mark on history. Ordinary Germans lived through the highs of Nazi propaganda and military victories, but also suffered through the devastating lows of bombings, food shortages, and moral collapse. The impact of the Nazi regime is still felt today, both in Germany and around the world. Understanding how life was under Nazi rule allows us to learn from the mistakes of history and to ensure that the horrors of the past are never repeated. By reflecting on the suffering of the victims and the complicity of those who turned a blind eye, we can ensure that future generations will remember the importance of resisting totalitarianism, racism, and hatred.